I never imagined that an inheritance lawsuit would end with a mother shouting, "You were never my daughter," right there in the courtroom, while her husband collapsed in sobs, admitting a 30-year-old secret. I am Judge Kimberly Harris. I'm 49 years old. I've spent more than 2 decades in the courts of Los Angeles, and believe me when I say I have seen it all. But this damn case kept me awake for weeks. Because one thing is applying the law, and a very different thing is watching an entire family fall apart in front of your eyes as you strike the gavel. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from so I can see how far it has reached. The case came to my desk on a Tuesday morning. It seemed simple on paper. The heirs of Margaret Chen were fighting over the distribution of her estate. $3 million in properties, bank accounts, and a family import business she had built over 40 years. Margaret had died 6 months earlier of pancreatic cancer, leaving a will that apparently favored her youngest son, David, over her 2 other daughters, Patricia and Susan. Patricia, the eldest, 52 years old, was the one filing the lawsuit. She claimed that her mother had changed the will under undue influence from David during the last months of her illness. Susan, the middle child, 48, supported Patricia. David, 45, denied everything and said that his mother simply acknowledged that he had been the one who really kept the business afloat for the last 15 years, while his sisters lived their lives away from the family. The father, Richard Chen, 75, was there too, sitting in the front row, hunched over with a lost gaze. He was not directly part of the lawsuit because Margaret and he had separate assets for decades, but he needed to be present to testify about his wife's mental state before she died. The first hearing started calmly, too calmly. Patricia presented her arguments with professional coldness. She was an accountant and had everything documented. She showed hospital visit records, emails, text messages, where David supposedly pressured Margaret to change the will. David's lawyer countered by showing business financial statements, proving that he had indeed been the sole support of the family business, while his sisters lived in other states. But then Susan took the stand. And that's when everything went to hell. Susan began her testimony talking about how her mother had always been distant with her. How, since she was a child, she felt Margaret treated her differently, with less affection, with less patience. I thought it was the typical family drama, resentments accumulated over decades. But Susan kept talking, and her voice started to break. My mother looked at me strangely. She said, as if I reminded her of something painful. As if my existence was a problem she could never resolve. David's lawyer objected, saying this was irrelevant to the inheritance case, and technically he was right. But something in my gut told me to let Susan speak. 21 years in this job give you a sense for detecting when someone is about to drop a bomb. 3 months ago, I hired a genetic genealogy service, Susan continued. One of those DNA tests that are all the rage. I wanted to learn my roots, my ethnic origins. The results came 2 weeks after Mom's funeral. Silence in the courtroom was absolute. I discovered I have a half-brother, someone who shares 50% of my DNA. Someone who is neither Patricia nor David. Patricia stood up yelling this was madness, that Susan was making things up to manipulate the process. David remained silent, but his face had lost all color. And Richard Chen began trembling in his seat. I ordered a 20-minute recess. I needed to think. Technically, this didn't change anything about Margaret's will, but if there was an unrecognized heir, that indeed altered the legal landscape completely. And more importantly, I needed to understand what the hell was happening with this family. When we resumed, I asked Susan to explain more. She brought out documents, prints from the genealogy service, contact information. She had tracked down that half-brother. His name was James. He was 50 years old. He lived in San Diego. And he had been given up for adoption at birth. The father was Richard Chen. That's when Margaret Chen, although no longer physically in this world, managed to shake the foundations of what was left of her family. I asked Richard to come to the stand. The man could barely walk. I had to repeat the question 3 times before he answered. Is it true that you have a biological son named James, born in 1974? Richard nodded, tears running down his wrinkled face. Yes, Your Honor, I had an affair. Margaret found out when Susan was 2 years old. She forgave me, or so I thought. We never spoke of it again. Never. Patricia was in shock. David had his head in his hands. But Susan had an expression that was half vindication, half utter devastation. "That's why," Susan whispered. "That's why Mom hated me. I was born just 1 year before him. Every time she saw me, she remembered the betrayal. I wasn't to blame for anything, but I paid the price my whole damn life. And here we come to the moment I will never forget. The moment when this case stopped being about money and became something much darker." Patricia got up from her seat, walked directly towards Susan, and shouted in her face, "This is your fault. You have always been the problem in this family. Mom was right to treat you differently." I slammed the gavel demanding order, but Patricia wouldn't stop. "You were never really her daughter. You were never a real Chen. You're just the living reminder that Dad destroyed our home." I had to call security. Patricia was escorted out of the courtroom amid screams. Susan had collapsed in tears. David finally spoke up, defending his sister, telling Patricia she was sick. How could she blame Susan for their father's mistakes? And Richard Chen collapsed. He literally fainted in his seat. Paramedics had to come in, take his blood pressure, check that it wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't. It was a nervous breakdown caused by 50 years of secrets, lies, and accumulated pain. I suspended the case for 2 weeks. I needed time to investigate whether James had any legal right to Margaret's estate, even if he wasn't her biological son. I needed to evaluate if the will was valid considering all this new information. But above all, I needed this family to have a moment to process what had just exploded. During those 2 weeks, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I ordered psychological evaluations for everyone involved. It wasn't strictly necessary for the legal case, but I argued I needed to determine if anyone's emotional state had been manipulated or had influenced Margaret's decisions. The reports I received were devastating. Susan had dealt with depression and anxiety her whole life, always feeling she wasn't enough, that something was wrong with her. Patricia showed signs of extreme codependency with the maternal image, idealizing Margaret to unhealthy levels. David had developed a savior complex, feeling he had to compensate for their father's mistakes by being the perfect son. And Richard. Richard had spent half a century punishing himself in silence. When we resumed, I hired a family mediator in addition to continuing the legal process, because I realized that no matter what I ruled, no matter how I divided those $3 million, this family would be destroyed unless there was some kind of intervention. James showed up at the next hearing. Tall, slim, with clear Chen features. He sat at the back, watching the family he never knew. Richard couldn't look at him. Susan couldn't stop. Looking at him, after reviewing all the legal documents, precedents, and consulting with 2 colleagues specialized in inheritance cases, I reached my determination. Legally, James had no right to Margaret's inheritance because he wasn't her biological son and she never adopted him. The will was valid. Margaret was of sound mind when she modified it, and there was no sufficient evidence of undue influence by David. But here comes the controversial part of my ruling. I upheld the distribution of the will as Margaret had established. 60% to David, 20% to Patricia, 20% to Susan. But I added an extraordinary clause. I ordered that part of the liquid assets, specifically $500,000, be placed in a family trust exclusively for family therapy, with mandatory sessions for at least 2 years for all the Chen siblings, including James if he agreed to participate. The money could not be used for anything else. If they refused therapy, that money would go to a mental health charity. Additionally, I stipulated that the family business must be sold or managed by an external administrator for 3 years while the family resolved their conflicts, with profits distributed equally among the 4 siblings, including James. The courtroom erupted. David's lawyer immediately appealed, arguing I had exceeded my authority. Patricia's lawyer also objected. But I stood by my decision, arguing I had judicial discretion to protect the well-being of the beneficiaries and that a trust with specific conditions was perfectly legal. Was it controversial? Absolutely. Was it orthodox? Not at all. Did I care? Not really, because at the end of the day, Margaret Chen was already dead. The money was just money. But her children, all her children, including the one she never knew, were alive and deeply wounded. The appeal was denied. My ruling stood. 6 months later, I received a letter from Susan. She told me that the family therapy sessions had been brutal at first, Patricia refused to attend for the first 2 months, choosing to lose her part of the trust. But eventually she gave in. David and Susan began rebuilding their relationship. And James. James finally met his biological father in a controlled, therapeutic environment. She didn't tell me everything was perfect. She didn't tell me they were a happy family, but she thanked me for giving them a chance to heal that they never would have given themselves. This case taught me something fundamental about my job. Legal justice is necessary, it's important, it's the foundation of our society. But legal justice without compassion, without understanding the human element behind every case, is incomplete. Did I apply the law? Yes. Did I respect Margaret's will? Yes. But did I also use every ounce of judicial discretion I had to try something bigger than just dividing money? Also yes. Was it my most controversial ruling? Without a doubt. Would I do it again? Without thinking twice. Because in the end, I am not just a judge who interprets laws. I am a human being with the power to influence the lives of other human beings. And with that power comes the responsibility to try, at least try, to do something more than just apply paragraphs of a legal code. The Chen family will never be the same, but at least now they have a chance to be something new, something perhaps better built on painful truths instead of comfortable lies. And that, to me, is real justice. I remember perfectly that November morning when I opened the case file for the first time. It seemed at first glance to be a relatively straightforward case, a dispute over custody and family inheritance, the kind of matter that comes before my bench several times a month. But there was something in the preliminary notes that stirred a restlessness in me I couldn't identify at the time. The Martinez family was middle class, apparently functional for decades, until the death of the patriarch changed everything. What I couldn't imagine was that, in 3 weeks, I would witness the most painful breakdown I have seen in nearly 20 years as a judge. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was divided in a way that broke your heart. On the left, seated with her lawyer, was Patricia Martinez, the eldest daughter, 42 years old, with a face that showed sleepless nights and an almost fierce determination in her gaze. On the right, her younger brother Daniel, 38, accompanied by his wife. And in the center, as if the universe wanted to underscore the tragedy, sat their mother, Elena Martinez, a 70-year-old woman who seemed to have aged decades in a few months. Her eyes moved from one child to the other with a mixture of pain and silent pleading that pierced me from the first moment. Patricia had filed a lawsuit against her brother, alleging he had manipulated their father during the last years of his life to change the will in his favor. But it went far beyond money. According to Patricia, Daniel had deliberately distanced their father from the rest of the family, controlling access to him during his terminal illness, making medical decisions without consulting anyone, and ultimately ensuring that the family home and most of the savings were in his hands. Daniel, for his part, claimed he was the only one who truly cared for their father, while Patricia appeared occasionally for the photos, but never for the hard work of accompanying a terminally ill person. The first testimonies were shattering. Patricia took the stand and, with a trembling but firm voice, began describing how her father, a man she described as her childhood hero, had become increasingly unreachable. She told how her calls went unanswered, how Daniel was always present during her visits, monitoring every conversation. She recounted a particularly painful incident when she arrived at the hospital during a medical emergency, and the nurses told her Daniel had left specific instructions not to allow her access. As she spoke, tears ran down her face, and I noticed how her mother in the gallery was holding back sobs that made her shoulders tremble. But when it was Daniel's turn to present his version, the narrative became complicated in ways no one anticipated. His lawyer presented a personal diary their father had kept during his last 2 years of life. The entries were devastating. In them, their father expressed deep disappointment with Patricia, not for lack of love, but because, according to him, she had repeated patterns from her own life that had caused him immense pain. He spoke of addictions Patricia had hidden, of loans never repaid, of promises broken time and again. He described how Daniel had been the one to quit his job to care for him, who took him to chemotherapy at 5 a.m, who cleaned and cooked and listened to his fears in the early hours when the pain was unbearable. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence as the clerk read excerpts from the diary. I saw Patricia's face shift from indignation to something that seemed like a mixture of shame and unbearable pain. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Daniel, already on the stand, began recounting his version with a monotone, almost dissociated voice, as if reading a shopping list rather than describing the hell he had lived through. He told how for months he slept in a chair next to his father's bed, how his marriage nearly fell apart from the stress, how he spent his own savings on treatments not covered by insurance. And then he said something that completely changed the atmosphere in the room. "My father asked me to keep her away," Daniel confessed, looking directly at his sister. Not because he didn't love her, but because every time she showed up, he emotionally relapsed. He'd be depressed for days after her visits. He begged me to protect him from that emotional roller coaster, and I did. I kept the last promise I made to a dying man. Patricia jumped to her feet. Her lawyer tried to calm her, but she shouted with a broken voice, "That's a lie! Dad never rejected me, never." And then Elena, the mother, stood up too. We all expected her to defend one child or the other. Instead, with a barely audible voice, she said something that stunned everyone present. "They are both telling the truth, and they are both lying." I had to call a recess. I needed to process what I had just witnessed. In my office, I reviewed all the documents, declarations, and prior testimonies again. There was something deeper here, a family wound that dated back long before their father's illness. When we resumed the session, I made an unorthodox but necessary decision. I asked Elena to testify, even though she was not technically listed as a primary witness. What that woman revealed over the next 2 hours changed the entire case. She spoke of decades-old family secrets, unacknowledged favoritism, impossible expectations placed on both children in different ways. She explained how their father had treated Daniel as the child who had to be strong and sacrifice, while he had overprotected Patricia to the point of preventing her from truly growing up. She confessed her own guilt in allowing those patterns to continue, in remaining silent when she should have spoken, in believing love was enough without honest communication. And then she revealed something that no one, absolutely no one in that room knew. Patricia was not the biological daughter of the man who had just died. She had been adopted at the age of 3, after Elena and her husband lost their first daughter in an accident. No one had ever told Patricia the whole truth, only that she was special, that she was chosen, that she was loved. But their father, in his last months, had confessed to Daniel the burden of that secret and had asked him to take care of his sister, financially, precisely because he feared she might never fully support herself. Patricia collapsed. And it was not a delicate cry. It was a total breakdown, the kind of pain that comes from the deepest place when your entire reality shatters. Daniel, for his part, had silent tears running down his face, repeating over and over, forgive me, I should have told you differently." The family had completely fallen apart before my court, and I had to find a way to deliver justice amidst that field of emotional ruins. I ordered another recess, this time longer. I needed everyone to regain some composure, but mainly I needed time to think. I locked myself in my office and for nearly an hour walked back and forth, weighing every element of the case. Legally, the will seemed valid. The father was in full possession of his faculties when he amended it. There were 2 witnesses present. Everything was in order from a legal standpoint. But the human dimension of what I was, witnessing went far beyond any legal precedent I could cite. I called my assistant and asked her to bring the deceased father's complete medical records. I spent the next few hours reviewing every document, every note from the treating doctors, every psychological evaluation that had been done during his treatment. There was something I needed to confirm, a suspicion that had started to form during Elena's testimony, and I found it. 3 weeks before amending the will, the father had begun treatment with medications that had documented side effects on mood and judgment. It was not enough to completely invalidate his legal capacity, but it did cast a shadow of doubt over his emotional state at that critical moment. When we resumed the session the next day, the atmosphere in the room was completely different. Patricia had arrived with swollen eyes, but with a strange calm, almost unnatural. Daniel looked somehow smaller, hunched over in his chair as if carrying an invisible weight. Elena was sitting exactly in the same place, between them, but now the physical distance seemed an insurmountable abyss. Before allowing the testimonies to continue, I made a decision that I knew could be questioned, but that my conscience dictated as necessary. I ordered a full psychological evaluation of both parties and requested sessions with a family mediator specialized in trauma and grief. The lawyer's objection was immediate and vehement. Daniel's lawyer argued that we were unnecessarily delaying a case with clear documentation. Patricia's lawyer insisted that his client had suffered enough and deserved a swift resolution, but I upheld my decision. I explained that although my duty was to apply the law, I also had the responsibility to ensure that any sentence I issued was based on the most complete understanding possible of all the circumstances. During the following 2 weeks, while the evaluations were being carried out, I received reports that painted an even more complex picture than I had imagined. Patricia had indeed struggled with addiction issues years ago, just as the father had written in his diary, but she had been in recovery for the last 5 years, a fact the father apparently never fully knew because Daniel had filtered that information, considering it might be another false promise. Daniel, for his part, showed clear signs of extreme caregiver burnout, a well-documented syndrome that can lead to decisions and behaviors that under normal circumstances a person would never consider. But what really struck me was the report on the historic family dynamics. The mediator had managed to bring both siblings together, along with Elena, for several joint sessions. What emerged from those conversations was a pattern of broken communication that stretched over decades. Patricia had interpreted her father's overprotection as unconditional love, not understanding that beneath it was a constant fear of losing her as he had lost his first daughter. Daniel had interpreted the expectations of strength as trust and recognition, not realizing that it was actually a burden no child should bear alone. And Elena had remained silent, trying to keep the peace, unaware that silence was creating an abyss. There was a moment during one of the mediation sessions, according to what the professional in charge told me afterward, when Patricia was finally able to articulate something she had been feeling her whole life without being able to name it. She said she had always felt as if she were acting in a play where everyone knew the script except her, where there were invisible rules she never fully deciphered. And when she said that, Daniel responded with something that broke my heart when I read it in the report. He said he had also felt that way, but had learned to pretend he knew the script, playing the role of the perfect son until he no longer knew where the acting ended and his true self began. The day I received the mediator's final report, I stayed in my office late reading every word. There was a section I read 3 times because I needed to make sure I had understood it correctly. During one of the last sessions, Elena had revealed that she had documents she had never shown to any of her children. They were letters her husband had written to her during his last weeks of life, letters he wrote in moments of lucidity between treatments, when the pain was manageable and his mind was clear. In those letters, he expressed deep regret for how he had handled the situation with Patricia, acknowledging that he had projected his own fears onto her in ways that were unfair. He also expressed infinite gratitude toward Daniel, but along with that gratitude came an apology for having asked him to carry responsibilities that belonged to both parents, not just a son. Elena had kept those letters because she didn't know what to do with them. She was afraid they would cause more pain, that they would reopen wounds. But the mediator had helped her understand that pain was already present. What was missing was the complete truth that could begin to heal it. I requested that those letters be presented as evidence in the case. When they were read in court, the silence was so profound you could hear your own breathing. Patricia cried openly, but this time the tears were different, not of anger or betrayal, but of a pain that could finally begin to be processed because it had context and truth. Daniel had to leave the room at one point. I saw him through the hallway windows, leaning against the wall, hands covering his face. His wife was with him, and for the first time since the trial began, I saw him allow himself to be vulnerable, to be human instead of the stoic guardian he had played for so long. When he returned to the room, he looked different, as if something inside him had finally been able to break in order to then begin rebuilding in a healthier way. After Daniel returned to 2020, his seat, I made a decision I knew was unconventional. I temporarily suspended the formal procedure and spoke to them directly, not as a judge, but almost as someone who had witnessed the pain of a family bleeding out before my eyes. I told them I understood they had come to my court seeking justice, but after all I had seen and heard, I had to ask them what justice really meant in this context. Was it dividing assets and property according to a legal document? Or was there something deeper they needed to resolve before any ruling could truly have meaning? I could see the confusion on the lawyers' faces. This was not how these proceedings were supposed to work. But I had been on that bench long enough to know that sometimes what the legal system offers is not what people really need. I proposed something I had never done before in a case of this nature. I offered them the option to continue with formal litigation where I would apply the law based on the submitted documents, or they could choose a different path. They could work with the mediator for an additional period, with supervised sessions where they could explore not only the division of assets but the repair of their relationship as siblings, as a family. Daniel's lawyer immediately stood to object, arguing that this exceeded my powers as a judge, and technically, he was right. But before he could continue, Daniel raised his hand, asking him to stop. He looked at his sister for the first time in days, really looked at her, and I could see something breaking in his expression. Patricia was also looking at him, and in that exchange of glances, there were decades of history, complicated love, accumulated resentments, but also a bond that, despite everything, had never completely broken. Then Daniel spoke, his voice barely a whisper that I had to strain to hear. He said he had spent the past months thinking the only thing he wanted was for everything he had sacrificed, everything he had given caring for, their father, to be acknowledged. He had thought the will was that validation, proof that his efforts had meant something. But upon hearing those letters, finally understanding the mental and emotional state their father had been in during those last weeks, he realized that what he had really wanted all along was not a larger inheritance or material recognition. What he wanted was to be freed from the burden of perfection, from the role he had played for so long, and he wanted to get his sister back. Patricia began to cry again, but this time she got up from her chair. Her lawyer tried to stop her, but she completely ignored him and walked over to where Daniel was. For a moment, I thought the tension might erupt into confrontation, but instead, she simply sat down in the empty chair beside him. They did not hug. There was no dramatic moment of instant reconciliation, because real life doesn't work that way. But they sat together for the first time in months, and that simple act said more than any testimony given in my court. Elena watched her children from her place, tears running down her face as well. At that moment, I realized how much she had carried alone, trying to be the bridge between two worlds that seemed incompatible, protecting secrets she thought would keep peace, but in reality had only deepened the divisions. I asked if there was anything else she needed to share, any other information that might help us understand the complete situation. She hesitated for a long time, looking at her children sitting together, and finally nodded. What Elena revealed then completely changed my understanding of the case. It turned out her husband had made not one but two changes to his will in those last weeks. The first was the one we had been discussing, the one that significantly favored Daniel. But there was a second document, written just 3 days before his death, when he apparently had a moment of clarity between treatments. In that document, he had divided everything equally among his children again, with an extensive note explaining that his first change had been the product of fear and pain, not his true will. Elena had kept this second document because legally it was complicated, it had not been notarized in the same way as the first, and she had feared that presenting it would only cause more legal conflict without resolving anything. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The lawyers demanded to examine the document immediately, each seeking angles for their respective clients. But I raised my hand to call for silence and looked at Elena directly. I asked why she had decided to reveal it now, after all this time. She looked at her children and said something that stayed with me. She said she had spent months trying to protect them from pain, complexity, the uncomfortable truth that their father had been human and fallible until the end. But seeing them destroying each other in the name of his memory, she had understood that the protection she had tried to offer was actually another form of silence, another way to avoid a truth that could heal them. I ordered that the document be examined by experts in legal documentation. Over the following weeks, while we waited for the results, something extraordinary began to happen. Daniel and Patricia started meeting voluntarily with the mediator, not because the court required it, but because they had begun to understand there were pending conversations far beyond any will. I received reports from these sessions, and what I read was both heartbreaking and hopeful. They were beginning to talk about things they had never discussed before: childhood memories, resentments dating back decades, moments of connection they had forgotten amid the conflict. There was one session in particular the mediator described as a turning point. Patricia was finally able to talk about how her addiction had been a way to self-medicate against feelings of inadequacy stemming from never spotted, feeling good enough for her family. And Daniel was able to admit that his perfectionism had been armor against the terror of disappointing others, of not living up to expectations that no one had clearly articulated, but he had assumed were absolute. When I finally received the analysis results of the second document, I found myself in a legally complex position. The document was genuine, the handwriting was undoubtedly Richard Harris's, and the content was clear in its intention to restore fairness among his children. However, the lack of proper notarization and witnesses created significant legal ambiguities. Technically, the first will met all formal requirements, while the second, despite being chronologically later, lacked the procedural validity normally required to revoke the former. I spent sleepless nights reviewing precedents, consulting with colleagues, trying to find a path that honored both the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. I knew that any decision I made would be scrutinized, possibly appealed, and would set a precedent for future cases. But I also knew I had before me a unique opportunity to do more than simply apply rules mechanically. I had the possibility to acknowledge the human complexity behind every legal document, every signature, every last will. I summoned all parties back to my courtroom 6 weeks after the second document's revelation. When they entered the room, I immediately noticed that something had changed between Daniel and Patricia. They were not walking together exactly, but neither were they maintaining the hostile distance from before. There was a mutual awareness in their movements, a consideration of each other's space that spoke of difficult conversations that had taken place outside these walls. Before issuing my official decision, I did something else that surprised those present. I asked the lawyers to leave the room. There were immediate objections, protests about procedures and protocols, but I exercised my authority as a judge to create a different space, even if only temporarily. Once it was just the family, Elena, Daniel, Patricia, and me, I spoke to them in a way that probably violated all the judicial distance rules I had been taught in law school. I told them I had spent weeks trying to find the right answer in law books, precedents, and technical interpretations of testamentary validity, and I had found strong arguments for multiple paths. I could declare the first will valid based on compliance with formal requirements. I could recognize the second document despite its technical deficiencies based on evidence of mental lucidity and authentic intent. I could invalidate both documents due to the confusion and extraordinary circumstances under which they were created. Each option had defensible legal grounds. But I confessed that none of those purely legal solutions satisfied me because they all ignored what was truly happening in this case. What I had witnessed was not simply a dispute over material assets. It was the collapse of a family under the weight of unspoken expectations, rigid roles, and the inability to communicate love in ways everyone could receive. I told them that their father, in his final weeks, had been struggling with something many people face at the end of their lives. The terror of not having done enough, of not having been enough, of leaving his loved ones without some kind of final validation of his worth. Patricia began to cry silently as I spoke. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on his hands. Elena closed her eyes, and I could see the weight of years of secrets and silent mediation in the tension of her shoulders. I told them their father had changed his will not once but twice because he was desperately trying to say things he had never been able to express in life. The first change had been an attempt to recognize Daniel's sacrifice, to validate years of care and presence. The second had been the acknowledgement that love should not be quantified, that both children deserved to be honored for who they were, not for the roles they had played. Then I did something completely out of protocol. I asked them what they really wanted, not what they believed the law owed them, not what they thought their father would have wanted, but what they needed to be able to move forward as a family, if that was even possible. The silence that followed was long and dense. I could hear the wall clock marking every second, the muffled sound of traffic outside the building, the held breath of 3 people confronting a question they perhaps had never allowed themselves to consider. Daniel spoke first. He said that for months he had believed he wanted his sacrifice recognized, to have all he had given valued. But the weeks of mediation had shown him something different. What he truly wanted was permission to be imperfect, to admit that he had resented some of the demands of caring for his father, that he hadn't always been there for the right reasons, that sometimes he had acted more out of fear of disappointing than pure love. And he wanted to be able to say all of that without feeling like he was betraying his father's memory or his identity as the responsible son. Patricia then shared something that broke my heart. She said she had spent years feeling like the family's disappointment, the one who always needed to be rescued or forgiven. Addiction had been her way of confirming that narrative, of fulfilling the role she believed had been assigned to her. But recent conversations with Daniel had shown her that he too had been trapped in a role, that both had been acting out a script no one had consciously written but everyone had perpetuated. What she wanted was the opportunity to be seen as someone more than her past mistakes, to contribute to the family in ways that didn't always require needing help. Elena finally spoke, and her voice trembled with emotion held too long. She said she had spent her marriage trying to keep the peace, to smooth over conflicts, to protect everyone from uncomfortable truths. She had kept the second will, believing she was protecting her children from more pain, but now she understood that same protective impulse had contributed to the dynamic that had hurt them all. What she wanted was freedom from that role as perpetual mediator, the possibility that her family could learn to communicate directly without needing her to translate or soften every interaction. Hearing these confessions reminded me why I had chosen law in the first place, not to apply rules blindly, but to help people find paths to resolutions that honored their full humanity. I then told them I was going to make a decision that was legally sound, but also deeply personal. I decided to recognize both wills as authentic expressions of Richard Harris's will at different moments in his farewell process. I declared that the second document, despite its technical shortcomings, contained sufficient evidence of mental competence and genuine intent to be considered valid. However, instead of simply annulling the first in favor of the second, I ordered the estate to be distributed equitably between Daniel and Patricia, as specified in the second will, but with an extraordinary condition that I knew would generate controversy in legal circles. I established that both siblings, before receiving their full share, had to participate in a family mediation process facilitated over a period of 6 months. It was not exactly mandatory therapy, because I could not legally order that, but I structured the distribution of the inheritance in stages linked to their demonstrable participation in this process. They would receive an initial portion immediately for basic needs, but the rest would be released progressively as they completed the agreed-upon sessions. Additionally, I allocated part of the estate, with the consent of both heirs, to create a fund in Richard Harris's name to support addiction recovery programs and family caregivers, thereby honoring both experiences that had defined the relationships in this family. When I pronounced this judgment, the lawyers who had re-entered the courtroom seemed simultaneously fascinated and horrified. I knew I was navigating complicated legal waters, creating conditions that could be seen as overly prescriptive or beyond my jurisdiction. But I based every element of my decision on equity precedents, on the doctrine of substantial compliance with testamentary intent, and on my authority to structure remedies that served the interest of justice in extraordinary cases. What happened in the following months was something I could never have fully predicted. Daniel and Patricia initially attended the mediation sessions mechanically, as just another obligation to fulfill. But gradually, something began to change. The sessions created a space where they could dismantle the narratives they had built about themselves and about each other. Daniel began to see that his resentment was not truly toward Patricia, but toward a family system that had turned caregiving into a competition for validation. Patricia began to understand that her rebellion had not been against her family, but against the impossibility of being seen as whole and capable. I received periodic updates from the mediator, as my court order required. He told me about sessions where both siblings cried together for the first time since childhood, remembering the father they had known before roles and expectations hardened their relationships. He told me about difficult moments too, sessions where old patterns resurfaced, and it seemed progress was falling apart. But they kept showing up week after week, not only because the inheritance depended on it, but because something fundamental was changing in how they saw themselves and each other. Elena participated in some of these sessions as well, and witnessed conversations she had never imagined possible between her children. She sent me a letter 6 months after my judgment, handwritten on delicate stationery. In it, she thanked me for something that initially had terrified her. She said my decision had forced her family to do the emotional work she had been trying to do for them for decades. And in that process, they all discovered they were stronger and more capable than they had believed. The judgment was effectively appealed by Patricia's lawyer, not because she necessarily wanted it, but because he argued that my conditions exceeded my judicial authority. The case reached a higher court where colleagues reviewed every aspect of my reasoning. It was months of professional uncertainty for me, questioning whether I had allowed my empathy to cloud my legal judgment, whether I had crossed lines that exist for important reasons. The higher court ultimately upheld my decision with minor modifications, establishing that while the conditions I imposed were at the edge of judicial authority, they were justified by the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the implicit consent of the parties by not initially objecting. But more important than the legal validation was what I had observed in the process: a family that had been completely fractured, finding ways to reconnect. Now, years after that case, I still think about the Harris family regularly. I learned that Daniel eventually found a different balance in his life, allowing himself to pursue interests he had postponed during years of caregiving. Patricia celebrated 5 years of sobriety and became a counselor for others facing addictions. Elena told me in our last communication that her children now meet regularly, not out of obligation but by choice, and that the conversations are real in ways they never were when Richard was alive. This case fundamentally changed how I understand my role as a judge. It reminded me that the law exists to serve people, not the other way around, that legal documents, wills, contracts, judgments are imperfect attempts to capture complex human realities that always exceed the words we use to describe them, and that sometimes the truest justice requires seeing beyond what is written on paper to what beats underneath, the universal human longing to be seen, valued, forgiven, and connected. The controversy around my judgment never completely disappeared. There are still colleagues who believe I overstepped my bounds, that I allowed therapeutic considerations to invade territory that should be purely legal. And maybe they are right in some technical aspects. But when I think of Daniel and Patricia finding paths toward reconciliation, of Elena freed from her role as perpetual mediator, of a father whose contradictory last wishes finally led to something beautiful instead of destructive, I know I made the right decision. Not the safest legally, not the easiest to defend in purely procedural terms, but the most just, in the deepest sense of that word. And in the end, that is what matters when a family falls apart in front of your court, and you have the power and responsibility to help them find a path not only toward legal resolution, but toward the possibility of healing.